This video is to provide a brief introduction in interpreting structural formulas of molecules. You've seen this a little bit in the properties of water POGIL that you worked through. So you know that water has a formula of H2O. And so the first thing you need to know about formulas is we use these atomic symbols, the capital letters that are designations for the various kinds of atoms as part of the formula. So the H2O formula, the molecular formula for water, tells you there are 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. And we can draw this as a structure, what it looks like, as an O for oxygen with straight lines going out to the hydrogen. Now, when we get to chemistry, we'll talk about the fact that water looks like this with a bent shape and why that happens. It has all to do about electrons, of course, because remember, electrons are what are making things bond together. But you don't have to worry about that. Just be able to recognize that this particular shape is a structural formula for water. Sometimes people will draw other circles around the letters, but most of the times if we're just quickly sketching out a diagram of a molecule, we're not going to bother with anything besides the capital letters for the atomic symbols and the straight lines that represent the bonds that are holding those atoms together into a molecule. When it comes to drawing larger molecules, there's a couple of other shortcuts that happen. Of course, glucose, another one of those molecules you needed to know, has a formula, a molecular formula of C6H12O6. And so we need to get all of these molecules present in glucose. Now, glucose is a different shape because different molecules have different shapes, and our structural formulas usually give you some sense of that shape. So glucose actually is a ring shape. It has a ring that has 6 pieces to it. 5 of those are carbons, and then there's 1 oxygen. So if I get all my pieces here. So kind of the basic shape is this ring of carbons connected with 1 piece that's oxygen. Then on each one of these carbons, on one side, we have an oxygen, which is connected to a hydrogen, but usually we just write O and H next together instead of writing O-H. It kind of gets longer and wider. And on the other side, there's just a hydrogen. Again, on this particular carbon, it'll be the same sort of thing. We're going to have an OH, an oxygen plus a hydrogen on one side, just a hydrogen on the other. Each carbon has to have 4 bonds going off from its main point. So we had more oxygens and hydrogens, and even though this would be connected oxygen and then connected hydrogen, sometimes you'll see it written this way, making it look like it's connected hydrogen to oxygen. And then finally over here, we've got 1 more carbon connected to a hydrogen and an oxygen and a hydrogen and another hydrogen. So this is giving you a sense of what that molecule looks like. It's a ring shape, and it's based of carbons with hydrogens, and then on these carbons we have either a hydrogen or another oxygen hydrogen called a hydroxyl group. Now this is a lot of letters to write, and biochemists, the people that write these kind of formulas all the time, get lazy. So in actuality, you'll probably see something that gets rid of these carbons, and it'll draw that ring shape without the C's on the corners. And the assumption is working in the biological world, in the biochemistry world. I just got let me trim my paper, you couldn't even see that. There we go. So we just make the ring shape with the oxygen, but no carbons are drawn at those points. But the assumption is there is a carbon there, and that carbon is attached to hydrogen unless we tell you something otherwise. And so all we have to say is there's also an OH group attached to these various points. And then coming out of here, we have another carbon, and you just make a little angle on it and say there's an OH over here. So this kind of structural diagram is just a shorthand version of drawing this. We don't have to put in every carbon and every hydrogen. The molecules that make up fats are known as fatty acid chains. And so they end up being long combinations of carbon after carbon after carbon after carbon. And on most of these carbons, we have hydrogens attached. We'll be talking about the various types of fatty acids and how saturated fatty acids are full of hydrogens and unsaturated fatty acids are have some spaces to add more hydrogen. And once again, to kind of shortcut this part of a diagram where all you have is carbon and hydrogen, you sometimes will see just a zigzag line. And each one of those points, so let me see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got coming into this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's my 5 points for my carbon. So again, this is a shorthand way of writing this type of structural formula. We don't have to spell out every single molecule of carbon or every single molecule of hydrogen. You won't be working a lot with these molecular diagrams, but you need to be able to interpret them because we will be seeing a few. Another thing that you will see sometimes is a double bond. So if we take carbon dioxide for an example, that is a carbon, CO2 is the formula. 1 carbon, 2 oxygens. And structurally, the carbon is in the middle with oxygens on either side, but there's actually a double bond in between the carbon and the oxygen. So there is more than one bond. Carbon, you can still see, has 4 lines coming from it or 4 bonds coming from it, like any one of these carbons. And my ring of glucose, like this carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4. This carbon up here in carbon dioxide has 1, 2, 3, 4. That's stuff that we talk about in chemistry. Just trust me, that's how it works. But these are double bonds. And so this causes carbon dioxide to be more of a straight line or a linear molecule as compared to water, which again is really only 3 atoms, just like carbon dioxide, but it has a whole different shape. When it comes to biology, shape is really, really important. How these atoms are bonded together and the shape of the molecule. Molecules, even though they're so small we can't see them, they have 3 dimensions. They have mass, they have volume, they take up space, they have a particular shape. And that shape is what allows them to do the various functions they do in the body for living organisms, or if the shape gets wrong, then you may have a function that no longer works correctly. Like someone who is suffering from sickle cell anemia, their hemoglobin is shaped wrong, and that's what causes the problems that they experience as the various symptoms. So anyway, that covers what I just wanted to give you as an overview so you can kind of interpret these diagrams. We use the atomic symbols to identify the types of atoms. We use straight lines to show bonds. So if we have 1 line, it's a single bond. 2 lines, it's a double bond. Even in these ring structures or the straight line molecules that I showed you down here, you can also have double bonds. So if this particular fatty acid had a double bond in one of these places, it would show just 2 lines like that in the diagram. So you might see something like that, and that indicates there's a double bond between this carbon and this carbon. So if we were going to draw it out in actuality, we'd have a carbon here that would have 2 hydrogens on it. That's showing our second carbon. That's going to have 2 hydrogens on it. This other carbon over here is going to have 2 bonds. So it's not going to have 2 hydrogens, it's only going to have 1 hydrogen attached to it. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds, it's done. Same thing with this carbon, it's only going to have 1 hydrogen attached to it before it goes on to the next one. So these lines are representing the bonds, the letters represent the atoms, and you get some sense of what the structure is on how the molecule is written. Not so much with glucose, the C6H12O6 doesn't really give you much information, but if we take acetic acid, for example, we can write the recipe. Can we write the molecular formula for acetic acid, which is what is in vinegar, as CH3COOH. That particular spelling out of the formula tells you that you've got 2 carbons. This carbon has 3 hydrogens around it. And the second carbon is attached to an oxygen, and a hydrogen. And I've already talked about these OHs as going together over here in my glucose. And so then we have an oxygen, and since carbon needs 4 bonds, we've got 1, 2, we're going to have a double bond, 3, 4 bonds to that oxygen. And so the way the formula is written often tells us what the structure is going to look like. With something like these fatty acids too, one last point before I go on, you can often get very, very long fatty acid chains. And so we will use parentheses to say that we have this pattern of a CH2 pattern that repeats again. Here's another CH2, and here's another CH2, and another CH2. And so we get a formula that would be something like CH3, parentheses, CH2, repeated 12 times, and then a fatty acid ends with a COOH, because this tells you it's an acid. But that's not something you need to know right now. So hopefully this proves helpful, gives you a little bit idea how to interpret these formulas that you're going to be seeing in biology and more again as you move up in the sciences.